Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I wish to focus my contribution to this debate on the immediate needs of Tasmanians. The old, the homeless, those on welfare, and generally every Tasmanian and Tasmanian family is struggling right now. I acknowledge the long-term investments outlined by the Premier, and I'm pleased, albeit with qualifications, that the government is looking beyond the political election cycle to anticipate the needs of Tasmanians in the next decade, not just this one. However, I do have doubts about the government's ability to deliver projects to budget and on time. The government's track record for hitting targets is not good. Blowouts and delays at the Royal Hobart Hospital rebuild, perennial Bridgewater Bridge announcements. I note that the member for Bass suggested I think it was a dozen. I think I've counted about 29 so far. A decade of thumb twiddling over the Northern Suburbs light rail, the Tasman Bridge, and don't even get me started on the running joke that is Macquarie Point development. And isn't there just a hint of a thought bubble with some of the new projects recently announced? The Commonwealth Games have floated just a few weeks ago only to disappear into the ether. Now, out of the same ether, we have a $750 million football stadium at the Regatta Grounds. Nevertheless, for good and bad, I suppose, the government have a 10-year vision of sorts for Tasmania. That's great as far as it goes, but the Premier failed to show that he genuinely understands the hardships many Tasmanians are facing right now. It's a common theme that surrounds what this government does and everything it says. Very little real empathy with the battlers in the suburbs. Mind you, the Labor members here are no better. We had 3 sitting days this year so far, and Labor has failed to hold the government to account on any of the problems and concerns of everyday Tasmanians. Whereas Labor on housing affordability, education, quality, health costs, surgery waiting lists, the devastation caused by poker machines, and a dozen other bread and butter realities that ordinary families are grappling with every day. Where were those questions? Where is Labor missing in action? Mr Speaker, in my time here today, I want to outline some policies and programs the Premier could have included in his speech. Measures that Tasmanians need right now, not on the never. First, look at the housing crisis. But it is so much more than a housing crisis, Mr Speaker. For many, it's an absolute disaster. There are thousands of Tasmanians in housing stress, couch surfing, sleeping rough, homeless, or paying rent they simply cannot afford. 3 or more families sharing a single house. These people need help right now, and I mean tonight, not next week, or year, or in a decade, right now. It's disappointing and heartbreaking the Premier did not recognise their plight in his speech. Here are some suggestions he summarily dismissed in Parliament last week that could have been announced in his speech. One move to quickly ease housing pressure would be to limit short-stay accommodation, such as Airbnb, to rooms in the owner's principal place of residence. This would free up entire homes and apartments to be returned to the long-term rental market or owner occupation. Victoria and New South Wales are looking at various adaptations of this policy. Why not Tasmania? The Premier turned the idea down flat. Another ready source of housing would be to release the hundreds of empty homes lying idle in our cities and suburbs. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Tenants Union of Tasmania recently published data from TasWater that showed there were 192 residential properties across the Hobart City Council municipality that had a high chance of vacancy, 115 in the neighbouring Glenorchy City Council and 256 in Launceston City Council. These properties use less than 10% of the average household water consumption for 3 consecutive years and therefore were almost certainly vacant. That is 563 inner-city residential properties we know of that sit empty during a housing disaster. A conservative estimate is that there's potentially 2,000 empty homes in Tasmania. 2,000 homes could be 2,000 families with a roof over their heads. Mr Deputy Speaker, in cities as diverse as Vancouver and Melbourne, for example, Homes left empty for more than 6 months without a reasonable explanation are taxed 1% of the value of the property. Why can't we do something similar here in Tasmania? Another reform turned down flat. So what did the Premier do instead? He provided $220 million of land tax relief to property owners. He justified this as a measure that would put downward pressure on rents. But anyone who's completed first-year economics would know that won't happen. What will happen is a whopping payday for wealthy property owners. There's nothing in this for tenants. Mr Deputy Speaker, we know that last year's cuts did not result in more affordable rent. Quite the opposite, in fact, with rent still significantly increasing and more Tasmanians experiencing housing stress. The fact is that residential rents are primarily determined by market forces, not the cost landlords incur. Respected economist Saul Eslake agreed. He said, "It's a myth propagated by the property industry that land taxes affect rents. They don't." Mr Deputy Speaker, the rich continue to get richer and the poor tenants gets it in the neck. Again. The Premier needs to come up with concrete policies and programs that will genuinely provide rent relief to struggling Tasmanians now and not do the bidding of the landlord lobby. And he made a big deal over the housing market entry program and boosted the First Homeowners Grant program, which may make a marginal difference in assisting people into a home, eventually, but which may, economists say, distort the market as the main outcome will be an increase in the price of homes by the amount of the subsidy. And what about the homeless, or the thousands of Tasmanians close to it? There was nothing from the Premier on reducing the waiting times for affordable social housing. What we should have seen are concrete plans to immediately increase the stock of public housing, homeless shelters and appropriate dwellings for those with special needs. The Premier is keen to crow about how strong the Tasmanian economy is, but that is not keeping our vulnerable people safe and warm at night. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, I want to turn to the education policy, which scarcely received a mention in the Premier's speech, except for some vague infrastructure promises and re-announcements. Again, as it was with housing, the Premier failed to deal with the everyday pressures. He failed in any way to address the problems with the quality of education our children are receiving as they sit in classrooms, and in the end, isn't this the most important thing we can do? The literacy and numeracy skills of our young people are an absolute embarrassment. How could we get education so wrong? Respected UTAS demographer Dr Lisa Denny analysed NAPLAN data of a cohort of Tasmanian students across 10 years. She found that by the time that group reached grade 3, 16.5% were ranked either below or at a national minimum standard in reading. Alarmingly, that increased to 28.5% of students by the time that cohort reached Year 9. And Dr Denny pointed out that the national minimum standard sets a very low level of proficiency for literacy and numeracy skills, with students at that level potentially requiring additional assistance to enable them to achieve their potential. So a third of our students can't even achieve that low mark. They are struggling to make any headway with reading and writing as they progress through school, and that, Mr Deputy Speaker, is an absolute disgrace. Mr Deputy Speaker, I have no doubt that all members of this House would agree that education is the key to young people thriving and is an important protective factor against social and economic disadvantage. However, we consistently see over many years a chronic underfunding of public education. We can't even fully fund the school resource standard. It's hardly surprising then that we have poor literacy and numeracy outcomes. It's another false economy. What the Premier should have included in his speech was a commitment to immediately fund the school resourcing standard. That's not a gold standard either. That's a bare minimum requirement, and we don't even meet that. But it would mean that our overworked teachers could deliver the minimum level of quality education and not have to stretch budgets, dip into their own pockets for materials and learning aids, or watch their pupils simply go without. We are failing our students and we are failing our teachers. And as a society with all our first world riches, that is shameful. Mr Deputy Speaker, the state of our health system also needs immediate intervention. I will take a moment here, Mr Deputy Speaker, to stand with the Premier in his acknowledgement and appreciation of our health and hospital workers who have borne the brunt of Tasmania's COVID response. However, I do know from the many healthcare workers that have approached me that there is a disconnect between clinical staff and their administrative and political masters. I hear of bed blocks, understaffing, stress and sheer exhaustion. We are running a health service on the goodwill of health professionals, but there's a limit to how much they can possibly take. Make no mistake, Mr Deputy Speaker, they are at breaking point. The Premier had nothing in his speech that went to fixing the immediate problems in healthcare. He ignored the calls from doctors, nurses and allied health workers that improvements to our hospital system are needed now before it collapses completely. The Premier should have announced a package of interventions, policy changes and funding to get on top of the interruptions caused by the pandemic, including the blowout in the elective surgery list, the backlog of patients needing to see specialists, excessive ambulance ramping, bed blocks and so much more. Mr Deputy Speaker, we know just about the best way to relieve pressures on our tertiary and frontline health providers is to increase investments in programs that treat and keep people in their home and communities. Putting people in hospitals is not only massively expensive, it's bad for their long-term health. It seems that we are constantly playing catch-up, spending more and more money just to manage the symptoms of our broken health system rather than treating the underlying condition. The Australian Bureau of Statistics has given us the title of being the country's unhealthiest state. We have the highest stress levels, body mass index, blood pressure and smoking rates in the country. We have the highest rate of heart stroke and vascular disease. We have the highest rate of chronic kidney disease, the highest rate of adult obesity and the highest incidence of depression. With these kinds of indicators, unless we change the way we deliver healthcare, it's easy to see how health can become a bottomless pit. The Premier acknowledged in his speech that when people are treated in the community with the right help, they can recover sooner, but then failed to back that up with adequate investment or programs. We need a government to immediately fund allied health and community care services. Mr Deputy Speaker, there are many areas that should be targeted. In his speech, the Premier talked about the new Police Ambulance and Clinician Early Response Team, or PACER, which I understand is doing a fantastic job delivering support to people within their communities with a focus on those experiencing mental health episodes. But it's only a 2-year pilot and only in the south of the state. Mr Deputy Speaker, why waste 2 years to tell us something we already know? The PACER program should be funded and staffed statewide now to give our doctors, police, paramedics and mental health professionals the support they need now and to keep people out of hospital. Another matter that needs urgent attention is a shortage of GPs. I'm hearing from my constituents that many people simply cannot find a GP who will take them on. The no new patient sign has gone up in practices around my electorate, let alone the well-known GP shortages in the regions. Many of my constituents can only afford a visit to the GP if it's bulk billed, and finding a bulk billing medical practice is close to impossible. So even if they can secure an elusive doctor's appointment, the chances are they have to pay a contribution and they simply can't afford it. To illustrate, Mr Deputy Speaker, I visited my GP last week and was charged $82 for a single consultation. That means after rebate, I was out of pocket $42.90. And I can tell you I took a double look and a deep breath when I saw the bill. But I'm one of the lucky ones because I could afford it. But anyone who understands the battle that many Tasmanians will be facing at the moment will know that finding the $40 plus for a GP visit is simply out of the question for many. Mr Deputy Speaker, if people can't access affordable primary health care, 2 things happen. One is that they remain untreated, which means they get sicker, which means they end up with chronic conditions in our hospitals. Or they present at the hospital emergency department, which is overstretched, and they go back out to their homes and communities and the cycle starts again. I appreciate that fixing the GP shortage is a complex issue that involves action from all 3 levels of government, but I urge the Premier to make it a priority. Mr Deputy Speaker, dental and oral health are also pressing matters. Recent figures released by the Health Department show that patients are waiting on average 2 years to get an appointment with a public dentist. Further, a report commissioned by St Luke's Health found that 62% of Tasmanians avoided or delayed visiting the dentist because of the cost. Mr Deputy Speaker, it is well understood that oral health is essential to maintaining a person's general health and well-being. poor oral health causes considerable pain and suffering by changing what people eat, their speech, and their quality of life and well-being. All this adds to the cost of healthcare, because if you fix oral health early, you reduce the risk and severity of other health issues. For example, I've seen a report that linked bacteria from untreated gum disease to serious health problems like diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and even premature birth. Mr Deputy Speaker, in Tasmania, I understand dental problems to be the most common reason for preventable hospital admissions. You may recall the media reports from late last year where dentists in Hobart's northern suburbs, my patch, told us that to save on future dental costs, a lot of young people want all their teeth taken out and have dentures made. The media reported one dentist is relaying a particularly grim day. It said 5 young children under 5 years of age all having extractions because of dental decay. And by the end of the afternoon, I think we counted up, I actually removed 60 teeth. How can it possibly have come to this? I know the Premier is aware of these problems and has some programs in place, but my plea to him is to double, triple his efforts, as poor dental health is ruining the lives of many Tasmanians and placing an intolerable burden on our whole health system. Mr Deputy Speaker, in my contribution here today, I've tried to highlight the immediate needs of everyday Tasmanians and make a plea to the Premier not to leave them behind or forget them. Yes, the Premier's speech was full of rhetoric on growing the economy and providing jobs, and I get that. This is a Conservative government and it's what we should expect. And for the record, Mr Deputy Speaker, broadly speaking, I agree with the Premier. A strong economy is important. But it's not everything. It's nowhere near everything. What worries me is the unspoken neoliberal assumption that economic growth will trickle down. Well, it doesn't. As we've seen elsewhere in the world, tax breaks and benefits for the wealthy do not trickle down to everyone else. The rich get richer and the poor, well, we know exactly what happens to them. Today I focused on 3 fundamentals we should, as a society, be able to provide to our people: decent housing, a good education and effective healthcare. Nonetheless, Mr Deputy Speaker, that is nowhere near the end of it. There are many more problems we face that desperately need government attention, including dysfunction in the aged care and disability sectors, the denial of problem gambling addiction causes to society, animal welfare, particularly in the racing sector, gender equality, election donation reform, and the too often hidden tragedy of domestic violence. Mr Deputy Speaker, the government can add these to the list of bread and butter issues they either ignore, dispute or under-deliver on. I've made the case that through underfunding and inefficiencies, this government, and to be fair, its Labor predecessors, has allowed too much of us to fall off the economic bandwagon. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, regrettably, the Premier's speech was an opportunity lost to really recognise the plight of many Tasmanians who struggle to get by. Having said that, I believe all of us here are here primarily to make this island we call home a true paradise for everyone. My plea to the Premier is, in your quest to build the Tasmanian economy, please take a look in the rear vision mirror and understand that many people need your help right now, not in 10 years' time, right now. Please, Premier, do not leave them behind.
Here, here.
Mr Deputy Speaker.
Minister for Women.